Hey everybody, and welcome back to AP World History. Today we're going to be doing another one of these reviews in preparation for Unit 6 review. So what we're going to be looking at is a period of time about industrialization. So we'll look at the social, political, economic, cultural, and environmental aspects related specifically to the industrialization period from around 1750 to 1900. Let's go ahead and get started. So first off, when we talk about social issues or social impacts of the industrialization period, we're going to be talking about a couple of things in particular. The first thing that I want to talk about is looking at state expansion. So we're entering into this period where European countries like Great Britain, France, Germany, Spain, as well as other countries like Japan and even the United States are practicing what's titled imperialism. And this is an attempt to try and take over as much land as possible in an effort to become the most powerful country. But obviously, as European powers or as imperial powers have territorial disputes between various places, there's a need for moderation or mediation, I guess is the better word for it. So in Africa, when we look at European powers specifically, as they're trying to figure out some of these disputes, we have the Berlin Conference that takes place in 1884 and 1885. And generally speaking, this conference ended up dividing Africa amongst the European nations that were there. So particularly France, Great Britain, Germany, the Dutch were there as well. Italy even gets in on it too. These are the things that they are looking to try and get. All right, so they're trying to figure out the best way to divide Africa. Some key considerations here, though, is that no Africans were actually invited to this conference to discuss the types of borders and types of larger issues that Europeans are more than likely not familiar with. So we're talking about the social and ethnic differences within Africa that Europeans didn't really think about when they went about drawing the borders up of these different countries. That's why I'm going to put this as at least part of the social impact, because we're going to start to see that people groups along ethnic as well as religious lines end up being separated across several countries, and then they'll also be put in the same country with people groups and ethnicities that they wholly oppose and have opposed for quite some time. That will cause further social issues in this area well after even Europeans exit Africa. Going on, we also have the Proclamation of 1763, which says that Britain established this line after the French and Indian War that said that no colonist in the 13 colonies could expand west past the Appalachian Mountains. This angered the colonists because they were fully expecting to be able to go west and look at what they wanted to settle, and they expected that territory to be theirs. But instead, Britain goes against that and gives it to the natives, which kind of sets up some of the social tensions between the colonists and then the British, which then leads us into European imperialism. When we talk about European imperialism, we're going to look at what are some of the responses from the areas that Europe controls. So, for example, in Africa, we are going to see things like Pan-Africanism originate, whereas the shared call for a united and independent African nation. We also see that in India, the Sepoy Rebellion, even though it's a failed rebellion overall, it starts what's referred to as the Indian National Congress, which immediately upon creation, which by the way, it was created by the British and it was controlled by native Indians, one of their first calls to action was to gain Indian independence from Britain. So kind of a weird thing here where Britain sets up the Indian National Congress full knowing that they are going to request independence in India. We also see this similar idea take place in Southeast Asia. It's known as Pan-Arabism. We will talk more so about this once we get to post-World War I, where European countries are going into what's now the Middle East and taking control of those areas. However, these areas are still looking to be in their own controlled by their own people. When we look at migration, we also see that this is a social aspect, at least in part, because we have two major groups of people who are in particular moving to the United States. So we have the Chinese and the Irish who are coming to the US and they're looking for jobs. Now, in particular, both the Chinese and the Irish will work on the Transcontinental Railroad. They won't work on the same jobs. Chinese laborers would usually get the more dangerous and less paying jobs, whereas the Irish would be paid more, and they would not be responsible for working with the nitroglycerin that was used to blast through the mountains of the Colorado Rockies. Irish also migrated to urban areas and had jobs in factories in particular. And this leads to this growing new social class in the United States known as blue-collar and white-collar workers. So it's this kind of division within the middle class that separates kind of blue-collar, I would describe as more like hands-on, more physical labor-based work, whereas white-collar is less labor-intensive and oftentimes paid better than blue-collar. But around the world, we also see that Chinese people in particular are targeted through things like the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Chinese Immigration Regulation and Restriction Act. The first one happens in the United States. The second one happens in Australia. What we see is that there's an argument here where people are blaming issues in their respective societies on Chinese immigrants. So in the United States, the argument was, well, Chinese immigrants are taking American jobs. The only thing is that, yeah, they are getting jobs, but they are jobs that Americans do not want because of the level of safety that's involved. Most Chinese immigrants are responsible for handling the nitroglycerin, which was incredibly unstable and carried a great amount of risk to it. Americans didn't want those jobs. So it was a false narrative that was promoted during this time in the 1880s. And I think this is something that we can even still see today. But the biggest difference is obviously it's no longer Chinese workers, but now it has shifted in particular to Hispanic workers as well as Muslims. Moving on, though, to the political aspects of the Industrial Revolution. And you'll see here, I'm going to continue talking about the Berlin Conference because the Berlin Conference isn't just a social aspect or even a political aspect, but it's also a cultural and an economic aspect as well. So the purpose of the Berlin Conference was to settle these territorial disputes in Africa between European countries. And this was their diplomatic way of solving those tensions. They had had conflicts prior to this. That was not effective, so this Berlin Conference offers European powers a political and diplomatic way to establish their territorial claims in Africa. So what we see is that places like France and Great Britain become the winners of the Berlin Conference, as both gained large amounts of territories, not only in terms of land mass, but also in natural resources. Now, I'll say that probably Great Britain is the better out of these two in terms of the natural resources that they get. A lot of France gets a lot of area that is in the Sahara Desert, which typically does not have as many natural resources or the natural resources that are desirable at the time. So for example, gold, ivory, diamonds, eventually palm oil even. They didn't really have as much access to that as what Great Britain did. Ultimately, this leads to more peaceful relations among European nations. However, not all of these satisfied claims were received well, because obviously you have winners like France and Great Britain, but you have losers as well. So places like Italy really didn't get a whole lot. Germany got some, but perhaps not as much as it wanted. Same thing for the Dutch. And obviously, we cannot forget that no Africans were invited to this conference, which goes to show you how Europeans thought and treated Africans at the time. As we go on to political imperialism, we start to see that because of the Second Industrial Revolution, industrialized nations like the United States and Great Britain look to some of these isolated areas of the world and they see them as untapped markets for all of these goods that these countries are producing thanks to factories. So, for example, in China, Great Britain has the Opium Wars, which effectively opens up China to European trade, specifically, in particular, Great Britain, but also to some extent France as well. And it creates this new market of goods, not only opium, but all of these manufactured goods developed in these factories to be able to be sold to China, which boosts the economy of Great Britain. So here we see it's not only political, but it's going into economic. As we look to the United States, they do something very similar with Japan, although perhaps less violently. In this, the United States offered Japan one of two options. You either open it up for U.S. trade and expansion, or you will be invaded. So seeing the military and technological might of the United States and also seeing China lose to the likes of Great Britain caused Japan to look at their situation and say, maybe we're better off signing a treaty. Remember, in this area, or this sphere of influence in Asia, China is the dominant power of the time. Yeah, Japan is fairly strong, but China is much stronger than Japan. So upon seeing China get opened up and defeated by the likes of Great Britain, and then seeing similar types of technologies and abilities in the US or with the US, Japan takes the better alternative, perhaps in this case, and signs what's called the Treaty of Kanagawa. And this ends up allowing the U.S. to go in, establish factories, railroads, etc. And Japan experiences a growth of industrialization that no other country in the world ever experienced. The rate in which they industrialized was unlike any other. As we go on, we also have to look at some of the environmental effects of industrialization, and a lot of these will not be positive. In fact, I would say that most of these, if not all of the environmental effects, are negative. One of the things that we start to see develop in certain countries is something called a monoculture. And in a monoculture, we see certain countries responsible for creating one particular cash crop. And these cash crops are seen as desirable products that are crucial for the second industrial revolution. So these could be things like tobacco, palm oil, rubber trees, things like that. These countries would be exploited and given the ultimatum of you must produce this crop. For example, Brazil was a large producer of rubber. That ended up creating a monoculture where they are then being used as an export economy where the only purpose of their economy is to send money outside of that particular country. You can imagine what sort of economic impact that's going to have on the actual workers and people of those particular places. So what we see is that not only do the crops or not only do we see the land be dominated by one particular crop, but we also see that disease spreads much easier in a monoculture. It leads to an overall lack of biodiversity, as well as it leads to these unsustainable agricultural practices that will not be able to continue, especially agricultural production in the future. We also see, too, that as new technologies like the steamship require coal, and as all of these factories require coal, the use of coal dramatically increases as a result of the Industrial Revolution. One of the things, or one of the developments that is led to is coaling stations that were used to power coal-powered ships. This inevitably has a lot of negative implications as it relates to the amount of pollution that's then put into the atmosphere, which perhaps we're seeing today in regard to global warming. Next, as we move on to some of the cultural aspects of the consequences of industrialization, again, you'll see here, we're at the Berlin Conference again, and we have to look at the cultural consequences of what happens to the native Africans post-Berlin Conference. And this is where we see some of the major pitfalls of Europeans not thinking about the ethnic and cultural and religious differences within Africa, because we start to see that groups of people are not only separated across multiple countries based on their ethnicity, but we also see that groups of people who have traditionally not been allies with one another, in fact completely opposite, we find that Europeans put them in the same country, which leads to further internal conflict based on culture and social aspects within those countries. And perhaps that just makes things even more difficult, not only for Europeans as they're attempting to control these areas, but perhaps this could be a cause for better understanding why there are some issues in Africa today along very similar cultural and social lines. Now, along with that, we also have to look at some of the effects of migration as it's playing a part in all of this as well. So we start to develop what are referred to as ethnic enclaves. And one of the biggest examples that we see not only in the United States, but perhaps in other areas that experienced massive migration is the development of Chinatowns, which would be an ethnic enclave. So these are areas where there is a heavy presence of a specific ethnic, racial, or other group of people that are there. And we also see, kind of connected to this, is something called chain migration. This is a process where a group of people from a particular country, state, county, you name it, move to another area of the world, and people from those same areas migrate after them, and they go to the same place. We see that here in Gainesville, Georgia, where again, we have a high Hispanic population here. So this is kind of a desirable place for people coming from Hispanic countries to immigrate to in the United States because it's very similar to perhaps their home state or hometown or whatnot. And then let's look at economic. We're going to spend a lot of time here on the economic part because the chapter spends a lot of time emphasizing the economies, not only because of the impact that industrialization had, but also the emphasis that imperialism is going to play in the development of all of these industrialized countries. So when we look at European countries, we see countries like Great Britain, France, Germany, Spain, and other countries like the US, Japan, and to some extent even Russia are practicing imperialism as a way to conquer more lands. They're justifying these ideas through several rationales. The first is this idea of nationalism. We start to see these ideas of becoming the best nation, having the most land. Things like that start to develop these seeds of countries seeing themselves not as equal to or working with other countries, but working against and competing against other countries. We'll come back to this idea of nationalism when we talk about World War I. But we also see social Darwinism come to the scene. This is developed out of Darwin's ideas about evolution. And to be clear, Darwin is not a social Darwinist. He does not believe in these racial ideologies. Rather, people have used his ideas of evolution and applied them to the various races within humans. So it basically asserts that some races are genetically superior to others, and therefore these less superior or lesser races are meant to be dominated or exploited by superior races. This is a racial ideology that Europeans use to justify their rule of places in Africa. The United States even does this as they apply it to places like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. They look at them as lesser people because of the color of their skin, the lack of technology that they have, etc. We also have cultural diffusion and assimilation as a factor promoting imperialism here, where countries are looking to diffuse their culture, spread their culture, and then effectively assimilate those people into their own culture. Specifically, we're talking about religion. If you look back to the Spanish as they conquered Mexico, they were converted. The process of conversion was at the center, at least part of the main goals of some of the original expeditions into the New World. And last but not least, we also have this desire for natural resources. So things like coal, palm oil, rubber are all going to be incredibly important natural resources in driving not only future imperialistic endeavors, but also the Second Industrial Revolution itself. As we go on in this economic, we also have labor systems. So things like corvée labor, slavery, and indentured servitude still exist at this time. Corvée labor was used by the British to build the Suez Canal that connected the Mediterranean Sea with the Indian Ocean. Indentured servitude was still existing not only for people coming to the New World from England and those areas, but we also see Indians come from India and then use indentured servitude to move around the British Empire. And then, of course, during this time, slavery is still prominent, especially in the Western Hemisphere. Over time, as we get closer to 1900, more and more countries either eliminate the slave trade or eliminate slavery itself. And by 1900, very few countries are practicing slavery as our formal definition of it is. However, obviously, there could be arguments that could be made suggesting that slavery still exists, but just in different contexts. Next, we also have to look at monopolies. So as countries are expanding, they're using what are referred to as joint stock companies to establish economic strongholds in various places, and by doing so, continue to build their empire, especially when we look at the Dutch East India Company and the East India Company. The Dutch East India Company becomes a monopoly that controls the spice trade in Indonesia. It also has a stronghold in South Africa. The East India Company, which is controlled by the British, effectively controls the spice trade that exists in India. In the United States, we see things like the Standard Oil Company, as well as Carnegie Steel, develop huge amounts of wealth and, by extension, power. When we look at expansion, during the Second Industrial Revolution, the U.S. is expanding not only domestically, so kind of internally, but also outside of the U.S. So we have things like the Monroe Doctrine, the Trail of Tears, and the Indian Removal Act as examples of ways in which the U.S. is practicing imperialism, kind of spurred by the Industrial Revolution. The Monroe Doctrine was issued by James Monroe that effectively said that no European countries could create a colony in the Western Hemisphere. The Trail of Tears was an event because of the Indian Removal Act. Andrew Jackson forcefully removed Native Americans, specifically the Cherokee Natives in southeastern United States, moved them to reservations, inciting what's referred to as the Trail of Tears. That way, Americans could gain territory previously held by Native Americans. Internationally, though, we see the United States expand thanks to the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War. With the Spanish-American War, America gains Guam, Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico, and starts to come to the forefront of imperialism and kind of starts to rival places like France and Great Britain. Ultimately, though, we do see one of the colonies, the Philippines, fight back. However, ultimately, the U.S. prevents them from becoming their own independent nation, which kind of puts all their other colonies, it sends a warning to them that if you want to rebel, you can try, but we're going to fight you and prevent you from being able to do that. And that is seen by and enabled by a lot of these Second Industrial Revolution technologies, like the steamship that allows for metal boats to be able to use and go and fight in a greater capacity than what they have prior to this. Ultimately, when we're looking at the economic impacts of the Industrial Revolution, we can't forget about the technologies that existed that propelled the Second Industrial Revolution. So things like railroads, steamships, telegraphs, light bulbs were all developments that are not only influencing economic aspects, but they're also influencing political and social ones too. We also see that we have things like the Bessemer process that's increasing the demand and availability of steel, that lead to things like the Trans-Siberian Railroad, as well as the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States. Other technologies ended up causing this demand for natural resources to increase. So, for example, rubber, palm oil, and coal are going to be three notable natural resources that are going to be exploited in an effort to continue the Industrial Revolution so that companies can continue to make more money. And that brings us to an end of this Unit 6 review. This is by no means expansive of the entire chapter, but I think it does a nice job of kind of throwing into context a lot of the major things that are happening around the world as it relates to industrialization and imperialism. All right, so that's all I have for us today. I want to thank everybody if you ended up watching this video even a little bit or till the end. Thank you for the support. Thank you for everything that you do for me. I am so appreciative of everybody. And if you haven't liked or subscribed, please make sure to do that and make sure that you have the notifications set to on. That way you can keep up to date with anything that I may share in the future. Thanks.